And I'd like to talk a little bit more about Louisa as well. So I don't think she gets enough attention. Both were born in New England in the early 1850s. Cyrus was born in Portland, Maine, and Louisa in Newburyport, Massachusetts, although she grew up in South Boston. Louisa was the daughter of a fish merchant and attended school, and Cyrus was the son of a paper hanger. They met in Boston. Cyrus had moved there after losing his small publishing business to the Great Portland Fire of 1866, after which he had left school to help support his family. His home had also burned in that fire as well. In Boston, he launched his own paper called the People's Ledger. The Ledger was a combination news, fiction of the day, using well-known authors like Mark Twain, Louisa May Alcott, Will Carleton. Cyrus didn't hire these authors directly yet. These were reprints and exchanges between publishers, kind of like the internet sites today where the same story is posted across multiple sites. The People's Ledger boasted a small circulation after its first year of about 2,000. He liked Boston, and he made the South Congregationalist Church his home base of social life. He sang in the choir, attended Sundays to hear the Reverend Everett Hale, who was a well-known minister at the time, himself the son of a publisher and a writer for the magazine Atlantic Monthly, which is still around today. Cyrus grew up in a musical family. His parents sang in the church choir. His father played trombone in the local town band. And he himself learned to play the organ. For his life, he loved church music, hymns. He owned increasingly large organs throughout his life. His middle initials, HK, stood for Herman Ketchmar, the local church organist and music leader in his hometown, after whom his parents had named him. For all of 1871, Bostoners, particularly schools and church choirs all over town, had been preparing for this massive music festival called the World's Peace Jubilee that was happening in Boston. Among the concerts, which included Johann Strauss, the Waltz King, already known for his Blue Danube Waltz, were performances of combined choirs and orchestras whose the musicians themselves numbered in the thousands. In this sea of people, he would meet his future bride. Louisa Knapp was also singing with her choir in the festival. She was the youngest in a large family. She and her 5 sisters had been educated in Boston's public school system, and the Knapp sisters all worked outside the home, teaching, making clothing, and singing with area music clubs. 2 of Louisa's teachers were music teachers at the nearby Perkins School for the Blind, which was the school that Helen Keller would attend. Louisa, too, trained to be an educator. However, instead of teaching, she became the personal secretary to the founder of the Perkins School, Samuel Gridley Howe, who lived near Louisa and her family. Howe's wife was Julia Ward Howe. She was a social activist and an author. Today, she's probably best remembered for penning the song, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. Cyrus and Louisa met during the Jubilee. Clearly, the two shared music as an interest, and they had a 3-year courtship. They were married on March 10, 1875. Edward had this nice quote about them in his book on Cyrus, A Man from Maine. From the moment of their marriage, they became equal partners in their determination to find a place in the sun. They became pregnant with Mary within the year. Cyrus was still far from being a business success, and he was still looking to make his mark on the world. Now, with a family to support, he started looking at cheaper options for printing the People's Ledger. In 1876, while Louisa was 8 months pregnant, Cyrus visited Philadelphia to attend a journalism conference, which was being held during the World's Fair taking place that summer. Philadelphia was an early adopter of printing technology, and the city had become one of the country's most prolific publishing centers. While in town, Cyrus learned that he could save about $1,500 a year printing the People's Ledger in Philadelphia. He figured that was enough to live on, so with Louisa, they made plans to leave Boston. The World's Fair also happened to coincide with the United States' 100-year anniversary. I wish I had more time to talk about this event specifically, as we're coming up on America's 250th anniversary next year. It was really a showcase of the country's inventions, artwork, music, and industry. Inventors like Thomas Edison showed his precursor to the telephone. Susan B. Anthony read the Declaration of Women's Rights at this event. It really would have been a pretty cool sight. Mary was born on August 6th, after Cyrus returned from his trip. A few months later, they packed up their belongings and moved out of Boston. It's believed that the young family arrived in Philadelphia on Thanksgiving Day, 1876. To supplement his income from the ledger, Cyrus worked in advertising. He worked for a local newspaper. In 1879, he started a second paper called the Tribune and Farmer, and this was a journal centered on agriculture and horticulture interests. The Tribune also featured fiction, a youth column, and most importantly to our story, a ladies' department. Once married, Louisa focused on Mary and the care of her husband, who tended to neglect his health in favor of his work. They weren't on easy street by any means yet, and it's likely that they spent most of those years under stress of financial hardship, or at least financial insecurity, I guess I would say. Cyrus would soon find the magic formula, which involved focusing on advertising, especially advertising to women. And Louisa, in addition to keeping him upright, would play an important part in that success. Cyrus assembled the women's column of the Tribune himself, using syndicated boilerplate articles. It was an easy way to add filler to his paper, and in this case, attract women readers and the businesses that would advertise to these readers. The US was entering the age of mass markets, where products could be produced and shipped nationally. Women advertisers exercised much of the purchasing power. In their roles as caregivers, women brought for the entire family. They bought the groceries, the clothing, household and cleaning products, appliances, toys, all these things that were becoming mass-produced. Advertisers realized, well, we better advertise to the women because they're the ones that are buying it. Unfortunately, Cyrus didn't do a great job of making choices for the women's column. What he believed represented women's interests fell flat with readers. Mary remembers that her parents talked business all the time. Louisa had a look and explained that he missed the mark, so Cyrus said, well, you run it. And Louisa said, okay, I will. She rejected the reprinted material and instead wrote biographical sketches, articles on cooking, sewing, published letters from readers. Soon, most of the reader mail that came into the Tribune was directed to Louisa. She enlisted others to write, included recipes, which they themselves tested. Cyrus, he was really a better salesman than an editor. He knew when he had talent, and he knew how to showcase that talent. So by November of 1882, when Mary was 6, Cyrus was advertising the Tribune and Farmer, the horticultural magazine, as well known for its ladies' department by Mrs. Knapp. Soon the column became popular enough to take over a full page, and in 1883, Cyrus decided to sell the Tribune and create a new magazine with Louisa at the creative helm. And so, the Ladies' Home Journal and Practical Housekeeper was born, soon to be the most popular magazine in America and the anchor of the Curtis Publishing Company's success and the Curtis family's incredible wealth. Louisa served as its editor for 6 years. If you read the journal, it probably looked a lot different from this first issue up here on the left. The magazine under Louisa and Edward had a strong literary focus. Stories and letters to and from readers were the main feature. Aside from its stories, the magazine had columns devoted to sewing, cooking, housekeeping, flowers, houseplants. During Louisa's time, the magazine supported evolving ideas about women's roles. It was pro-women's right to vote. It encouraged women to read about world events, spend time outdoors, keep a bank account, and train for a skill just in case they didn't get married. All these things in the earlier Victorian era, women were discouraged from doing. The thinking was that until then, you couldn't be a true woman and operate in the male domain, like discussing politics or having a job. And they used the term unsexing. So if you went out and got a job, you were unsexing yourself. Of course, all the women who had been widowed or otherwise had to go out and support their family, pointed out the unfairness of not being considered true women any longer. From this point, Mary's life would be bound to the company. She grew as the Curtis Publishing Company grew. As she aged and declined, so did it. The journal had 25,000 subscribers in its first year. A lot of these were probably carryovers from the Tribune and Farmer. By its second year, it had 200,000. The family started to see some returns from their hard work. They moved across the Delaware River to Camden, New Jersey, which was a little quieter, more suburban than where they were in Philadelphia. After a few years, they built this lovely mansion. They had a carriage house, 2 domestic servants. But we know from Mary's diary, she still had chores to do. Louisa still drove herself around town in her carriage. They were still a pretty down-to-earth family. The Ladies' Home Journal's editor was named Mrs. Louisa Knapp, not Mrs. Cyrus Curtis. So in a loosely guarded secret, they chose to conceal her identity by using her maiden name in combination with Mrs., suggesting she was married to a Mr. Knapp, and thus had nothing more than a business connection to Cyrus Curtis. Conversely, those in Camden who knew her as Mrs. Cyrus Curtis had no reason to suspect she was anything other than Cyrus's wife and Mary's mother. And the reason they used this pen name, Louisa said, was a disinclination for newspaper publicity. Despite not publicly revealing her role as editor until her retirement in 1890, she seemed to enjoy dropping hints. So articles written about the editor in the Ladies' Home Journal occasionally noted she was married to a publisher, for example. And I kind of wonder, little kids aren't particularly good at keeping secrets. I kind of wonder, how Mary kept this secret of her mother's double life. By 1888, the magazine had over 700,000 subscribers. This is 3 times more than any other magazine. During Christmas time, they'd sell over 1 million issues, counting the newsstand sales. Just before Louisa stepped down as editor, Cyrus doubled the price of the magazine, which consolidated his gains, but he lost readers. So that number went down to 400,000 just before Edward took over. So few outside the business knew the depth of her role. Louisa would retire in 1889 as the chief editor of the largest circulating magazine of any that had come before. The story given at the time of her retirement was that Mary had complained that Louisa was always working. She was quoted as saying, "Mama, whenever I need you, you always have a pen in your hand." Louisa said this hurt her to hear, so she could no longer continue. This doesn't seem like the complete story. Mary was 14 by then, attending school. We also know from letters here at the Bok Tower archives that Louisa would undergo some surgeries in the early 1890s. So there may have been some health issues that the family just kept private. Also, Cyrus wanted to expand the business to England, and perhaps Louisa wanted no part of that. Dutch immigrant Edward Bok was appointed chief editor to begin in January 1890. Louisa continued for another year answering mail and running the Practical Housekeeper column. Edward had a successful literary gossip column, which had grabbed the attention of Cyrus and Louisa. Remember, the Ladies' Home Journal was very fiction heavy, very literary. So they recognized that Edward's usefulness in that area. His appointment, though, it was met with skepticism and sometimes even ridicule. He wasn't the first man to edit a women's magazine, but he was an unmarried man, and so that made a difference. Several biographers point to Edward being called effeminate or worse for taking over the magazine. Nonetheless, they embraced the controversy as a way to gain even more readers in that any press is good press kind of strategy. Despite the initial doubts, Bok's tenure continued to grow the success of the journal. Louisa and Mary did spend more time together, it seems. They often visited the shore in Atlantic City, which was a short train ride from where they were in Camden, New Jersey. Given Mary's 1892 journal entries from when she was 15, she seems a sensitive, busy, happy kid. She had chores, took piano lessons, read a lot, went to church, played with friends. She had a best friend named Edna Starr. Most of Cyrus and Louisa's business meetings took place in their home, so Mary saw people from work come and go. On a Tuesday, she noted that Mr. Bok came in the evening, played games, etc., had a good time. There was no romantic interest apparent yet. Edward was 13 years older than Mary, but they saw a lot of each other. They remained formal. She always referred to him as Mr. Bok in her diary, even though her male friends at school were indicated by their first name. Over the next few years, they definitely seemed to grow closer. Mary would later admit that they never actually dated. It was always Edward accompanying the Curtises to concerts or coming to the home for business. According to Edward, he took the helm of the Ladies' Home Journal having no knowledge of women, and he wrote that his attitude towards women was that of avoidance. He held Victorian-era views which propped women up as very moral, but also meant that they shouldn't get down and dirty in the trenches in what was considered men's affairs, like voting, for example. Mary recalled Edward as quite a bumptious young man, serious-minded, but with lapses. Edward was handsome and intriguingly confident. In general, Mary would gravitate to people with talent, confidence, and directness, the things that she saw in her parents. She also had no trouble managing ego, which, as she started working with famous musicians much later, would become almost a daily occurrence. Despite Edward's critics, the Ladies' Home Journal readership continued to grow. Cyrus's next move was to expand. He set his sights on the Saturday Evening Post, one of the oldest magazines in the United States. It was a publication linked to Benjamin Franklin, and that was someone Cyrus had admired. In less than 10 years, the Post would grow to 1 million subscribers, and at its peak, it was the largest carrier of advertising of its time. The editor of that magazine, George Lorimer, hired then an unknown artist by the name of Norman Rockwell. Today, the Saturday Evening Post and Rockwell are inseparable, with Rockwell's covers like Rosie the Riveter still instantly recognizable. Rockwell painted several portraits for Mary and her family. There's one hanging in the Curtis Institute of Music by Rockwell, which is a portrait of Mary. Cyrus started building a huge headquarters just next to Independence Square in Philadelphia. The company became highly modern. The new building had men's and women's lounges, a barber shop, an employee cafeteria. They gave concerts in the building. Beginning around 1912, the company employed a fleet of electric trucks for moving paper and making deliveries. The trucks each had a General Electric motor on each wheel, and they could only reach speeds of about 14 miles an hour, but that was A-okay for just making deliveries around the city. So this has just put things in perspective. 1876, Independence Hall, and then when Cyrus's building was complete in 1913, now it's the giant structure behind Independence Hall. So that's a 37-year difference. Backing up a little back to the 1890s, in the summers, the Curtises began spending time in one of Philadelphia's northern and most prominent suburbs, Cheltenham. The area held old Quaker-owned farms and mills, still occupied by some of the families that were deeded the land by William Penn back in 1682. Wealthy industrialists began buying up the land for their sprawling estates, forming Philadelphia's first suburbs. Such showcase properties included department store owner John Wanamaker, who had a 77-acre estate, and railroad magnate Jay Cook, who had a 200-acre property. In February 1893, Cyrus purchased a portion of the estate of a banker named Abraham Barker, who had fallen on hard times. The property included Barker's home, Linden, which Cyrus intended for a summer residence. In the increasingly affluent area, Mary and her parents were surrounded by more millionaires per square mile than anywhere else in the country. Names like Wanamaker, Stetson, the hat maker, Widener, Morris, Fox, Wharton, Lippincott. These are all names that are still on Philadelphia schools and universities and city streets. Boks and Curtises came together in June 1893 at Linden when Edward proposed to Mary. The papers called it the most important matrimonial engagement of the season, while Mary, now almost 17, was described as exceedingly attractive and well known in Philadelphia social circles. Wedding date at that time wasn't set. Cyrus and Louisa weren't in a hurry to see their daughter married. It's not clear if they disapproved of Edward, which I kind of doubt, or they just wanted Mary to gain some more experience before marrying. So after her engagement, they enrolled her in boarding school, while Cyrus kept Edward busy on business trips. It was a very dad thing to do. Mary was aware of this little plot by her parents, and she willingly left home to attend the Ogantz School for Young Ladies, is only about 4 miles away from Linden. It was a highly esteemed finishing school dedicated to educating girls who would navigate high society. Probably the most famous or recognizable alum would be Amelia Earhart. She was a student several years after Mary at the Ogantz School. Every aspect of the environment was monitored by the school. Guests could visit on Saturdays. Mail was reviewed by staff before passing it on to students. Ogantz girls were permitted to have lunch at only 2 restaurants in Philadelphia, and they were not allowed to drink the water from the city. Possibly there was a spike in typhoid fever around that time. Typhoid can be spread through tainted water. I won't tell you tainted with what, but the Schuylkill River, which was the city's water supply, was indeed tainted. Hopefully not anymore. Like many students there, Mary studied music, taking piano and music theory lessons. She was also a member of what was called the OG Club, one of 4 school societies. So in this photo of the OG Club, Mary can be seen confidently leaning on the highest branch in her frilly white dress. She stayed at the school just 1 year, less time than she had anticipated. She wrote that her father could not bear the separation beyond that 1 year. Since this is around the time that Louisa, who was 44, was having those surgeries that I mentioned earlier, it's also possible that, again, her health brought Mary home and they kept that private. Time spent apart didn't work. The 2 young lovers, Edward and Mary, were married on October 22nd, 1896, in a small ceremony at Linden. Mary was now 20. Her groom was 34. There were about a dozen guests in attendance, including Mary's parents and Edward's mother, his brother, and Mary's childhood friends from Camden, Edna Starr. That Mary and Edward's wedding was so modest is notable, particularly in comparison to the typical Philadelphia society wedding of that time. Cyrus gave her away, and according to a family member, Daddy cried through the whole ceremony. This big, powerful publisher, while some newspapers reported that Mary and Edward planned to sail to the Mediterranean on an extended tour for their honeymoon, they actually went to stay on a small farm in Milford, New Hampshire. Edward was probably so tired of getting on a boat for these business trips, he probably couldn't face it again, and so they just went somewhere quiet. Back from their honeymoon in 1897, the newlyweds and Edward's mother, Sika, temporarily moved into the fashionable Hotel Hamilton on Walnut Street in Philadelphia. They planned to build a home on land Edward had purchased in Marion, Pennsylvania, about 10 miles away from Mary's parents. Mary, she happily devoted herself to support of her husband. She entertained guests at their Philadelphia apartment, including friends Hamlin Garland, who was an author, his wife, Zulema Taft, who was a painter, as well as Edward's friend Harrison Morris, who was the director then of the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and his wife Anna Wharton Morris, who was a social activist and the youngest daughter of the prominent industrialist Joseph Wharton. If you've heard of the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, that's the same family. In early 1897, Mary would have learned that she was pregnant with their first child. William Curtis Bok was born 11 months after their marriage on September 7, 1897. That's him at his first birthday party, there in the middle. There were many delays in the building of their Marion home, but it was finally complete in 1903. They lived in an area generally known as the Main Line, which was very upscale. Lots of old Philadelphia families who were so well established, they didn't have to really work anymore. Even though this Curtis name held weight in that society, the mainliners saw the Boks as comparatively new money and initially excluded them from their upper crust activities. For example, Edward was believed to be deliberately excluded from certain club memberships. Thus, their circle of friends grew primarily from the art, music, and literary circles, as well as those in the area who, like them, found their successes in the more recent industrial age. Mary easily gravitated to neighbors who held music as a common interest, primarily a close neighbor named Edith Evans Braun, who would not only become a lifelong friend, but a major contributor in time and money to the Curtis Institute of Music. Mary and Edward's younger son, Carey, was born in 1905. Mary enjoyed what she saw as her personal duty to, as she wrote, keep the family fires burning, something she held in balance even after she became a working woman. Both children remembered Mary playing piano for them, with Curtis citing her music as one of his earliest memories. Edward, who Mary would later comment, had the European standard of a man being the head of the household. That was her statement. He was not enthusiastic about Mary even doing housework. After Curtis's birth, and with Edward often traveling, it sounds like she was kind of at a loss with what to do with herself, writing to a friend up here, "I had no housekeeping cares. I privately have been wanting them ever since we married, but he says wait, always, when I speak of it." Idleness had never really been part of her upbringing, but Mary now found herself with servants and a nurse for the children. Some of Edward's perspective on housework and childcare was likely the influence of his mother, who had grown up quite affluent. Losing the family's money was the reason that the Bok family had immigrated to the United States. And Edward had always stated that he felt this need to return his mother to the same life of leisure she had once known. Additionally, given the neighbors and their reluctance to accept the Boks into their circle, Edward might have also wanted to just kind of keep up appearances. At any rate, this is a time in Mary's life where it's kind of difficult to determine what she was up to. One friend she makes at this time is Joseph Hoffman, who's a well-known Polish pianist. Mary and Edward met Hoffman when he visited Philadelphia in 1898 on his second U.S. tour. Hoffman had been a child prodigy, performing since he was 10 years old. He was a wildly popular musician. He was the same age as Mary. They struck up a friendship and later a business relationship at the Curtis Institute, which would last for decades. The en vogue vacation spot for the wealthy Philadelphians was Maine, which I hope Cyrus got the irony in that, because Philadelphians going to Maine, they thought they were really roughing it. And they would buy these beautiful houses, but they would call them cottages, so it sounded more rustic. So especially the Bar Harbor, Desert Island area, and then the small neighboring towns of Rockport and Camden, Maine. In the summer of 1902, Louisa purchased a tract of land in Rockport that bordered a golf course and ran along the coast, providing enough land for a house for she and Cyrus, as well as for Mary and Edward. Mary loved Rockport as did Edward. They spent nearly every summer there. Rockport and Camden were small towns, but not sleepy retreats. There was a big shipbuilding industry there. So from their home, the families could have seen these huge commercial wooden sailing vessels being built in the harbor. Cyrus had taken up yachting, also a popular hobby among his peers, but it soon became a way of life for him, and their love of boating would pass down to Mary and to her children as well. In May of 1903, Cyrus purchased his first steam yacht, and from that point, it was difficult to find him on land. He was almost always on the yacht, whether for business or for pleasure. In 1909, Mary suffers a miscarriage, a child she believed would be a little girl. Then just a few months later, in February of 1910, Louisa dies at age 58. The cause of death was listed as Raynaud's disease, which is rarely fatal on its own, but it affects circulation. So it's likely Louisa suffered some complications from that. This throws Mary into a deep depression. And now at age 33, she starts to reflect on her life. She says to Edward and her father that with the exception of having 2 boys, she'd never accomplished anything. Nothing close to her mother, nor Cyrus, nor Edward. This really concerned Edward and Cyrus, and they reached out to the women they knew who were active to try and pull Mary, to get her sort of out of this state. She would begin a new chapter in her life. One which involved an outwardly turned generosity and accomplishment that would have made Louisa even more proud of her daughter. So the response to this tragedy really put Mary in control of her story for the first time. Not only did Cyrus reach out to friends to help Mary get involved, but Edward supported many of the causes in which Mary gravitated. There were a lot of causes to choose from around this time. Mary was smack in the middle of what historians refer to as the progressive era. It was a time when there was widespread social movements addressing issues brought about by rapid industrialization, political corruption, and immigration, as well as a prevailing call to those who had made their fortune in America to invest their wealth back into the country. Progressive in this sense doesn't refer to any particular political party. In fact, many of these efforts were bipartisan. So like Republican President Theodore Roosevelt's interest in environmental conservation, Democrat Woodrow Wilson's investigations into child labor, all these were part of the progressive era. Mary and her family's philanthropy was reflective of this era. Others like Andrew Carnegie, who had made millions in the steel industry, put out a challenge to his peers, saying that the rich had an obligation to, what he said, build ladders, as he called it, for people who wanted to better themselves, whether it be building parks, libraries, schools, concert halls, or otherwise. This kind of philanthropy is at this time is uniquely American. The super wealthy in Europe kept their money. They did not tend to build free public libraries or programs for the less fortunate. Other leaders in the movement included women's suffrage advocate Jane Addams, civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois, and investigative journalists like Mark Sullivan, who had assisted Edward in 1906 with the Ladies' Home Journal's investigation into drug manufacturing. There are literally dozens of causes that Mary became involved in. Too many to discuss. So I'm going to limit a little to the arts. Mary and Cyrus initially got started with the Philadelphia Orchestra, which had formed in 1900. The orchestra performed at the Academy of Music, built in 1857, pictured here, which still stands today. Music was a passion still shared more closely between Mary and her parents than she and Edward. She had been slowly chipping away at Edward, though. He was convinced that classical music was over his head and that it was more of a women's pastime. Edward believed in the civic value of music, uplifting culture, wholesome entertainment, which is why he often included the arts education in the Ladies' Home Journal, but he just didn't believe it was something that businessmen did. Mary recruited their friend Joseph Hoffman to win Edward over, and then also Leopold Stokowski, who in 1912 became the new conductor for the Philadelphia Orchestra. This is Stokowski pictured here with Mary and Edward. These were two men that Edward respected. They were successful. They flew in the face of the flighty artist stereotype Edward held, and with enough prodding, Edward gradually figured out that classical music indeed was not over his head, nor was it just for the ladies. So he joined Mary in her interest in supporting the Philadelphia Orchestra. Leopold Stokowski and his wife, Olga Samaroff, often found themselves in the company of the Boks. Olga's real name was Lucy Hickenlooper, and she was from Texas. She was a well-known concert pianist, probably at the time more famous than Stokowski. Olga knew the particular struggles of an American trying to make a career in music, which at the time, Americans had no credibility in the field. If you weren't European, if you weren't white European, you weren't taken seriously. Olga's teacher at the Paris Conservatory had said on their first meeting that Americans were not meant to be musicians. Hoffman was Polish. Leopold was born in England. So no doubt Olga shared her thoughts on the experience of American musicians. In her autobiography, she wrote that well into the early 20th century, the United States had ceased to be a colony politically, but not musically. And she said this gave Americans a deep-rooted national inferiority complex. So while Hoffman and Stokowski are generally credited with being Mary's advisors in the formation of the Curtis Institute of Music, a lot of what Mary did moving forward is reflected in what Olga says. Mary's major philanthropy began with the settlement movement, whose fundamental premise was to address issues of the working poor, many of whom were now migrating to cities like Philadelphia looking for factory work. At the turn of the 20th century, the migration included many black families leaving the southern states, as well as an unprecedented number of foreign immigrants. As was the case in Philadelphia, many who came seeking a better life found themselves only able to live in the crowded tenements under pretty squalid conditions. Believing that education, cleaner living, and safer working conditions could alleviate suffering in society, settlement activists established community centers that offered educational resources, childcare, spaces for labor unions to meet, clubs, activities, really anything that a specific community identified as a need. Music was seen as a tool towards this means, particularly in a way to introduce new Americans to the country's culture and give them a viable way of making a living. They often use the term Americanize in this regard. The Philadelphia settlement started a music program in 1908, and it was growing exponentially. Mary would become involved with the school shortly after the death of her mother, and at the encouragement of Cyrus's friend Jenny Fells. Mary's financial support and work in promoting the school helped it to grow from a small department to an independent school, which is still around today. I worked there actually before I came to Curtis. Today it's the largest community arts school in the country, and it's also the largest employer of the largest single employer of musicians in the Philadelphia area. With $150,000, about $4.3 million today, Mary funded the construction of a new building for the music school. The cornerstone for the Settlement Music School, this building here, was laid on January 30, 1916. The school would offer low-cost lessons as well as other community services like career counseling, a cafeteria, and a bathhouse. The neighborhoods surrounding this school did not yet have plumbing, even in 1916, hence the reason for the bathhouse. To give you an idea of how seriously they took this type of music program, during the cornerstone ceremony, Former Pennsylvania Governor Edward Stewart called it the future hope of the Republic. Inside the cornerstone, Mary enclosed a note outlining her thoughts about the school, writing, "I feel strongly the responsibility of Philadelphians to the great number of foreigners who come to our city and become part of its life." And then a little later, "We can teach them our language, our customs, our ideals. I hope to see this done in the Settlement Music School, where music instruction is used as a means to this end." Mary dedicated the building to her mother, who so loved music herself. Mary was proud of the Settlement Music School throughout her life. However, she had been dreaming of building an American conservatory, one that would equal any in the world. She wanted a school that encompassed everything she had learned, all that she wished to support, the settlement movement, fine arts, the country at large, and the young American musician, whether they be native born or immigrant. Settlement had started an advanced program that had run into problems, and it was going to be discontinued in January of 1924. It's a complicated story. It had to deal with their grant awarding organization. So it was this program that was about to close that Mary used to launch her next project. They worked incredibly fast, finding a new building, staff, faculty. By the fall of the same year, the fully realized Curtis Institute of Music, which Mary named in honor of her father, would open its doors in its new location in Rittenhouse Square. The Curtis Institute, Mary wanted to give students every possible advantage. This meant world-class musicians on the faculty, purchase of the best musical instruments, school counselor, doctor, a lot of financial help. Sometimes it was clothing, sometimes it was paying for their families to come stay with them. She had amassed friends who would help, including Joseph Hoffman, Leopold Stokowski, Johann Grohl, who had been the director of the Settlement Music School, who then became the first director at the Curtis Institute. In addition to these primary goals, Mary would integrate the core values of the settlement movement, such as support of recent immigrants, employing music education as a means to good citizenship, and accessibility to all races, genders, and social classes. This last aspect wasn't a given at other conservatories of the time, who some restricted admission, sometimes by race, sometimes by gender, sometimes by country of birth. Mary's son Curtis, now a lawyer, assisted her in locating a home for the Institute, converting this stunning mansion, which was formerly owned by George William Childs Drexel and family, at the corner of 18th and Locust Street. The location was great. Public Park, Rittenhouse Square, was right across the street from the school. The area held a number of social clubs, beautiful churches. Mary also bought the two neighboring mansions on either side of the school, either side of the mansion, which would be used for additional teaching space and offices. In 1927, she would endow the school with a total of $12.5 million. This would allow for the school to provide all students with free tuition, and that's the practice that's still in place today. It's also part of the reason the school has stayed so small. It's only, from that point forward, it's only been about 170 students each year. Family stayed involved. Edward served on the advisory board for the new hall. Cyrus Curtis donated a 4-manual organ, completed in 1928. It's built into the wall surrounding the piano here. Mary's sons, Carrie and Curtis, served on the board, as did their wives and eventually their children. Today, Mary's great-granddaughter still serves on the board at Curtis. Mary's role didn't stop at money. She led every graduation ceremony. She was a connector of Curtis students with the professional music world and personally financed the early careers of several graduates. As you can see from the headline here, the effect was felt just a few years later, after the school started. The script is starting to flip, with this Berlin critic saying that the Curtis Institute should be the pattern for European centers. As Mary is working on the Curtis Institute, guess where we are? Edward is hard at work on conceiving the singing tower and sanctuary. It's actually Mary's long ago childhood friend, Edna Starr, now married Claggett, that introduced the couple to the area. According to some family members, they start to grow apart a little bit. I don't find this in my research. Mary obviously becomes much busier. She's not free to be by Edward's side as much. Edward's health is also starting to decline. By the time the sanctuary is open to the public, he's privately not well at all. Just to show a few details of Curtis, we have our own Samuel Yellen, the ironworker responsible for the work inside and around Bok Tower, including the brass door. At Curtis, we get our little nature-themed gate on the side entrance of the building, and on the right is the entrance to the concert hall. Mary also established programs at the Curtis Institute that would complement the sanctuary's mission, most notably the campanology program of study. Curtis students would spend several weeks a year at Bok Tower. Additionally, Mary brought composers down to study, hoping to encourage new works for the bells. As back then, it was typically arrangements of hymns and works written for other instruments. This carillon program didn't go really far. Most audiences were happy with the more familiar selections, but she tried. So here pictured are two students with carillon or Anton Breeze, and on the right is Italian composer Nino Rota. Rota isn't known particularly for bell compositions, but rather for his work on the score of the first and second Godfather movies. Edward passes away in January of 1930, and in one of Mary's letters, we see just how sick he had been. 3 years of great anxiety lie behind me, as my husband was not well at all that time. It was arterial sclerosis. He never knew it, however, although what he sensed I could not tell. But he made a splendid fight, and he lies now where he so much wished to lie, just beside his loved tower at Mountain Lake. Mary would still regularly visit the sanctuary, in particular yearly for the Easter service. Mary would live another 40 years after Edward, and her interest in supporting worthy projects in the arts and sciences did not wane. Most of the time, she chose to fund things that were important to the people she knew and loved. And she particularly invested in wherever she had a home, Florida being no exception. While Mary was still a student at Ogontz, Edward had introduced her to the Irish-born actor Annie Russell. Edward had interviewed Annie on several occasions, and upon introducing Mary, Annie said it marked the beginning of the dearest friendship she had ever established. Annie enjoyed a long and high-profile career that was often disrupted by health problems, but whenever Annie would come to town, she would always seek out Mary. In the early 1920s, Annie lived for a few months at the Bok home so she could receive medical treatment for a host of issues she had. Just seemed she was just plagued with everything from headaches to dental problems to eyesight issues. She really seemed quite frail. Their friendship led to Mary's funding of the construction of the beautiful Annie Russell Theater at Rollins College, which opened in 1932. The Boks had been wintering in Mountain Lake since the early 20s and encouraged Annie to retire to Florida as well. Annie had moved to Winter Park, and at the invitation of the school's president, Hamilton Holt, had begun teaching at the small drama department at the college. Mary was approached about helping to build the theater, and so she donated $100,000 for its construction and helped Annie to define a role that gave her directorship of the theater. Four years after Edward died, around 1934, Annie introduced Mary to an artist named Jules Andre Smith, who lived in Connecticut, but he spent winters in Maitland. Andre had started helping to design sets for the production at the theater. Smith was 4 years younger than Mary and had initially worked as an architect and gained a reputation as a fine artist. During World War I, he enlisted and became a war artist following the American Expeditionary Force through France and drawing pictures of places that had been affected by the war. He had injured his leg on barbed wire during his training, and it never fully healed, which years later, he actually had to have his leg amputated. Mary immediately liked him, writing to Annie that he was a grand person, and if she were younger, he'd have to look out. Andre seemed to like Mary too, and they struck up a friendship that seemed, at a minimum, extremely flirtatious. Mary would visit him at his Stony Creek, Connecticut home, but writing to her friend Esther Lape in 1938, Esther had been, her title is escaping me, but she had helped Edward run the American Foundation, that their relationship was not tending to matrimony. There is a rumor, however, that Mary did want to marry Andre and actually proposed at one point. However, Andre apparently had some insecurity over his lost leg, and he also didn't think that he could handle the social spotlight that Mary always seemed to be in. So Andre reportedly rejected her proposal. Nevertheless, in 1937, Mary helped Andre to purchase the property for and build the artist colony he called the Research Studio. There he gave classes, offered fellowships to artists, and a place where they could live and work, as well as exhibit their art. Mary commissioned the bell in 1937 from the same makers as the bells in Bok Tower. The original intent of this bell was to call the artists at mealtimes. Imagine if that was, what happened here. Mary had the initials of her, Andre, and Annie Russell inscribed on this bell. The research studio, later purchased by the city, and now it's the Maitland Art Center. It's really beautiful. It's open-air chapel, very sanctuary-like. It's walled in to help artists focus on the creative process. Mary didn't want her name to appear on the studio. She wanted it to be solely credited to Smith, but kind of nestled around the corner is this little plaque that says, "The research studio was founded in 1937 by Mary Curtis Bok for the purpose of encouraging the explorative approach to the art problems of the day." Cyrus would pass away in 1933, and Mary's sons stayed close to her in their adulthood. Mary's first grandchild was born to Curtis and his first wife, Peggy, in 1924. He would have 5 children in total, while Carrie and his first wife, Helena, whom he married in 1935, would have 2. Mary loved being a grandmother. She looks like she's about ready to run away with the one in this picture. And she would watch the grandbabies whenever her sons and their wives were out of town, leading to the statement here where she says, "My children are finding out how willing I am to have them travel. The further and the oftener, the better." In 1940, the Russian solo violinist Efrem Zimbalist became director of the Curtis Institute. Efrem had been on the faculty at the Curtis Institute since the late 1920s, so he and Mary knew each other well. Efrem had become a widower in 1938 when his wife died, singer Alma Gluck, with whom he had 2 children. As did many on the Curtis Institute faculty, Efrem spent summers in Camden, Maine with Mary. It had become sort of the summer school for the Institute, and they grew close. Efrem was quiet, modest man. As he tells the story, in the summer of 1942, Mary just blurts out, "We should get married." And that makes that Andre Smith proposal story all the more believable. And so they did. It was obviously a totally different relationship than she had had with Edward. Efrem was 13 years younger than Mary. He was a very understated person, a musician, but their marriage seemed very happy. She had a lot of confidence in Efrem as a director, and this allowed her to slow down a little bit. She was still active. Students remember her attending all the concerts and graduation ceremonies, but after this time she relaxes a little bit more and lets him call the shots at the Institute. Efrem sees the school through some really difficult times, World War II, and after. Of course, he has 2 children Now she has even more grandchildren to dote on, so she spends a lot of time focusing on family interests. By the mid-1960s, she's starting to show signs of dementia. Mary dies of heart disease on January 4th, 1970. She left behind a significant legacy, supporting music in particular, but also a countless number of small organizations and individuals who she just quietly sent a check to. That initial idea of creating an American conservatory to rival those in Europe, to educate students not just on music, but to be well-rounded people, that's still something that's emphasized probably more today even than in recent decades at the Curtis Institute. I heard someone asking about Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., the FBI TV show star. I heard that. So that's her husband's son, so that's him there, Ephraim Jr., with Mary.
Why isn't Bok on the tombstone?
She dropped the name when she remarried. Mm-hmm. She kept it in regard to the Curtis Institute, so anything with regard to the Curtis Institute, she's Bok because she was Bok when she founded. But in private life, she was fairly traditional in that way. You know, her husband's name was Zimbalist, so she went with that.
I like that they put Proverbs on the tombstone. I think it was very fitting.
I think so too. I agree. So I just wanted to close with this quote, which I think really wraps up her life's work. She is talking to her pastor in a letter. I have something to give not only to my family, but to a weird and sizable circle of friends and acquaintances. Everyone one touches needs something and should become a friend. I think her use of the word weird shows an open-mindedness here and a willingness to invest in ideas that maybe didn't even necessarily suit her personal taste. I find it inspirational. I know I just shown you a ton of slides, so thank you for listening to me ramble, and I hope you enjoyed it.